Imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting alone in your living room.
Right.
It's late. You know, that very specific kind of late where the whole house just sort of settles into a different kind of quiet.
Oh, absolutely. The ambient noise just drops off.
Exactly. The street outside is completely dead. The neighborhood hum is gone. And you are just, well, existing in this little bubble of isolation.
Just you and your thoughts.
Yeah, or maybe not even your thoughts. You're reading a book. Or let's be real, you're probably just endlessly scrolling on your phone.
Right. The classic doom scrolling.
Exactly. You're not really paying attention to your surroundings at all. And the only sound keeping you company is the steady, rhythmic ticking of this antique wall clock you recently picked up.
Mm-hmm.
But then, right at the very edge of your awareness, the rhythm stumbles.
Just a tiny variation.
Yeah, just a tiny hiccup, like a skipped beat. And, I mean, most of us wouldn't even look up from our screens,
We'll
right?
just chalk it up to old gears.
Right. Dusty springs that need oil. You make a mental note to, I don't know, take it to a repair shop someday, and then you
Yeah.
go right back to whatever you were doing.
Which is the logical, sane response.
But what if I told you that in that exact moment, that tiny hiccup wasn't a mechanical failure at all?
That it was something much worse.
Way worse. I'm talking about a scenario where that stutter was actually the sound of reality itself fracturing right in front of you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the absolute worst part, by simply sitting there, by letting your attention drift toward it, you are actively helping to tear that hole in reality even wider.
It is, well, it's a profoundly unsettling shift in perspective, and frankly, it's a violation of the basic trust we have in our physical environment.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, think about it. We are so accustomed to viewing the objects in our homes as completely inert, you know?
Yeah, they're just stuff.
Exactly. We treat them as subordinate to the laws of physics that we intuitively understand. We trust our clocks to merely report the time.
Not to manipulate it.
Right. And certainly not to act as a gateway. But the moment you start questioning the fundamental nature of those mundane objects, the entire comfort of the modern world, it begins to unravel.
That unraveling is exactly what we are exploring in this deep dive. Because today we're pulling from a single, just deeply chilling source.
It really is.
It's a video titled, "My Clock Repeats 1 Second and Something Happens," uploaded by the YouTube channel The Midnight Curator.
A very fitting channel name.
Seriously. And I've watched this thing several times now. It frames this temporal anomaly not as some, dry theoretical physics problem on a chalkboard.
Thank goodness, or we'd be asleep.
Right. It frames it as a suspenseful first-person survival story. The goal today is to really understand the mechanics of this very specific, very dangerous supernatural phenomenon.
Because we aren't talking about your standard haunting here.
No, not at all. There are no ghosts rattling chains in the attic.
No poltergeists throwing dishes across the kitchen.
Exactly. We are talking about localized physics warping, the structural integrity of time itself breaking down, and an unassuming antique clock acting as a conduit to a completely different dimension.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this right from the start, because my first thought when watching this was about the origin of the artifact itself.
The side street shop.
Yeah. Like, who in their right mind buys a creepy clock from a random, dimly lit side street?
Well, I think we have to look at the psychology of the collector here, or even just the casual antique hunter.
The thrill of the find.
Precisely. There is an inherent romance in finding something discarded and bringing it back to life. You know, in our world of digital precision.
Where our atomic clocks are synchronized to the millisecond.
Right, and our smartphones update automatically without us even noticing. In that world, an antique clock malfunctioning is usually seen as, well, the ultimate mundane annoyance.
Or, weirdly enough, it's seen as charming.
Exactly. It has character.
Yeah. But the origin of this artifact, as detailed by our source, it strips away that charm very, very quickly.
It really does. It was found in a side street shop, the kind of place that barely looks open.
Right. And the critical detail isn't the shop itself, but the warning the seller gave to the buyer.
This is the part that gave me pause.
Same here.
Yeah.
Because the seller doesn't just say, hey, this thing runs 10 minutes fast, or you have to wind it twice a day.
No mundane maintenance tips.
Right. The seller offers a very specific, ominous caveat. They say it doesn't follow time.
Which is such a bizarre way to phrase it.
It really is. Like if you buy a toaster and the guy says it doesn't toast bread, you know the heating element is busted. You assume a mechanical flaw.
Sure, a broken wire.
Yeah. But saying a clock doesn't follow time sounds like a bad translation. Or maybe just a merchant trying to add some, I don't know, mystique to a junk item to justify the price.
I disagree slightly with your premise there, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How come?
Well, I don't think it's a mistranslation or a sales tactic at all. I think the brevity and the specific wording of that warning are crucial.
Okay, lay it on me.
To say a clock is broken implies a mechanical failure within the device itself. A gear has lost a tooth, a spring has lost its tension, the pendulum is fundamentally off balance.
Something you can fix with a tiny screwdriver.
Right. But to say it doesn't follow time, that implies an act of defiance.
Defiance.
Yes. It implies that time is a current, a river flowing in one direction, and this particular object is actively refusing to be carried along by it.
Oh, I see.
It points toward a defiance of natural laws rather than a mere mechanical breakdown.
Okay, I suppose that makes sense, especially when you look at how the clock actually behaves once the observer gets it home.
You can hear that defiance almost immediately.
You really can. The source goes into painstaking detail about the physical mechanics of the ticking. It's not your standard comforting tick-tock.
No, the video describes it as having an uneven thinking pattern.
Which is such a creepy phrase.
Yeah.
An uneven thinking pattern. And there is a heavy pause before every single movement.
Right.
I was reading this part, and I'm thinking, okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because if a machine is hesitating, what does that actually mean?
That's the big question.
Right. Because I don't picture a broken gear. I picture, like, a person standing on the edge of a high diving board.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, they're looking down at the water and holding their breath before making a dangerous leap. They have to gather themselves. They have to push through a psychological barrier.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, does this hesitation imply the clock has a level of sentience? Like, is it a living thing trapped in wood?
Well, we have to be careful not to anthropomorphize it too much, though the temptation is certainly there.
It's hard not to when it has a thinking pattern.
True, but while the diver on the diving board analogy is evocative, I think it misrepresents the physical reality of what the source is describing.
Okay, so correct me here. What's actually happening?
Based on the mechanics detailed, we shouldn't assume sentience. Rather, we should look at it as a machine struggling against an invisible physical barrier.
A physical barrier.
Yes. In a standard clock, the escapement mechanism releases energy in steady, uniform increments. The energy transfer is constant.
Right. Tick, tick, tick.
Exactly. But this hesitation, this heavy pause, suggests the clock is encountering literal resistance.
Wait, resistance from what?
From time itself. If time is a forward momentum, this clock is trying to push through a medium that has suddenly become incredibly dense or distorted.
Oh, wow.
That hesitation is the physical manifestation of the clock's mechanism fighting against a localized reality that is actively resisting it. It is gathering the kinetic energy necessary to force its way into the next second.
So it's less like a person gathering courage and more like, I don't know, a submarine trying to push through mud instead of water.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The medium itself is hostile to the machine's progress.
That paints a terrifying picture for the person sitting in that room. You're trying to relax on your couch, and this wooden box on your wall is practically holding its breath, straining its internal gears, just to tick forward.
It creates an immediate, visceral sense of unease.
It really does. But as unsettling as that hesitant ticking is, a hesitant tick doesn't tear a hole in reality.
No, it doesn't.
A hesitation is just the preamble.
Precisely. The hesitation is merely the symptom of the underlying friction. The actual structural failure of reality doesn't occur until the environment hits a specific temporal threshold.
Right, which brings us to the midnight event, the transition point.
The 12.02 glitch.
Exactly. So let's put you, the listener, back in that room. It's the first night you're watching this clock, maybe a little mesmerized by its weird, straining rhythm.
You're almost rooting for it to make it to the next second.
Yeah, exactly. The hands sweep up toward the 12. It hits 12:00, then 12.0, and then at exactly 12:02, the clock pauses.
But it doesn't stop.
No. Instead of advancing to the third second, it repeats the strike. The source hammers this point home over and over. It is not skipping backward.
Right.
It is not catching on a bad gear.
It is two identical instances of the exact same moment.
That is just wild to me.
It is. And this is where we must draw a very firm line between what human intuition tells us and what the anomaly is actually doing.
Because our brains want a logical explanation.
Exactly. We are deeply conditioned to assume human error or mechanical failure in our devices. If a clock acts up, we assume a chipped tooth on the main gear.
Right. It's broken. End of story.
But a mechanical glitch still obeys the laws of physics. If a gear slips, the hands fall back. If a gear is jammed, the clock stops entirely.
It doesn't magically repeat a second.
Right. What's fascinating here is that a repeated second fundamentally violates the thermodynamic arrow of time.
The arrow of time.
Yes, it violates the forward momentum that governs all of physical reality.
Because time only goes one way. You can't undrop a glass.
You can unburn a match.
Exactly.
From the macro scale of planetary orbits to the micro scale of cellular aging and the decay of radioactive isotopes, the universe relies on an unbroken, forward-moving sequence.
Entropy. Right.
Correct. Entropy dictates that systems move from order to disorder over time. You cannot unscramble an egg, and you absolutely cannot repeat a second that has already passed into history.
So if the clock strikes the same second twice,
then the underlying timeline that it is measuring must be looping. We have to stop looking at the clock as a broken machine.
wait, so the clock is fine.
The clock itself is in perfect working order. It is functioning flawlessly. What is broken is the reality it resides in.
Thank God.
The clock is merely acting as a perfectly accurate recording device for an impossible paradoxical event.
That completely flips the script on how we interact with our environment. I was trying to come up with a way to visualize this while researching. I keep coming back to a television screen.
Right, let's hear it.
So imagine you're watching a live sports broadcast. You're watching a basketball game, and you see a player jump for a dunk. But right before he hits the rim, the footage stutters, jumps back a fraction of a second, and he leaps from the floor again.
A classic broadcast glitch.
Right. And when that happens, you don't get up off your couch and start smacking the side of your television set. You don't assume the physical glass screen in your living room is broken.
No, of course not.
You instantly understand that the screen is fine. It's the broadcast feed itself, the signal coming from outside your house, that has been corrupted.
I like that analogy a lot, but we need to push it one step further to truly capture the horror of this source material.
Okay, push it.
In your basketball analogy, the corrupted feed is distant. It's happening at a broadcast center miles away.
Right.
In the case of the antique clock, the corrupted feed is the localized space-time inside your own living room.
Oh, no. Yes.
The television isn't just showing you a glitch. The television is actively projecting that glitch into your physical space, forcing your immediate environment to loop with it.
Okay, that makes it infinitely worse.
Doesn't it?
Yes. Because if it's just a 1-second glitch on a screen, you rub your eyes, think you're tired, and go to bed. But if the actual fabric of your room is stuttering, that's not something you can just ignore.
You might try to ignore it at first. Denial is a very powerful human survival mechanism.
True.
But a single fracture in reality, even a 1-second loop, is entirely unsustainable.
Oh.
Think of it like a microscopic stress fracture in the windshield of a car driving at highway speeds.
Oh, I hate that.
It starts as a tiny, almost invisible fissure. But the sheer aerodynamic pressure and the vibration of the vehicle guarantee that the crack will not stay microscopic.
It's going to spread.
It will inevitably spread, spiderwebbing across the entire surface until the glass fails completely. The timeline is under similar pressure. Once that 1-second fracture occurs, it is bound to expand.
Which naturally leads us to question what happens when that fracture does expand. If a 1-second loop is a crack in the windshield, what does the spiderwebbing look like?
The source narrative doesn't let us wonder for long.
No, it doesn't. Because by day 3 of the observer watching this clock, the anomaly evolves. It doesn't just repeat the 12.02 mark. That extra repeating second begins to stretch.
This is a crucial escalation.
And this was the hardest concept for me to wrap my head around while researching this deep dive. The digital display of time, where the hands on the clock face aren't changing. It still clearly says 12.02.
Right.
But the observer's subjective experience of that single moment lengthens. It feels like it takes longer for that 1 second to pass than any other second.
This brings us directly to the physics concept introduced in the text, the temporal pocket.
The temporal pocket. Okay, break that down for us.
To grasp this, we have to visualize the timeline not as a rigid ruler, but as a piece of highly elastic string.
Okay, I'm picturing a string.
Normally, the string is pulled taut, vibrating steadily with the forward progression of time. At 12.02 on day 1, the initial anomaly caused a loop, like a tiny knot in the string. But by day 3, that knot is inflating. The repeated timeline node is stretching outward, creating a balloon-like structure. It is forming a hollow void within the boundaries of a single defined second.
A hollow void. So you're saying there's literally empty space being created where there shouldn't be any space at all?
Yes, and we know a fundamental rule of the universe. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Right, it wants to fill it.
Exactly. Whether it's atmospheric pressure rushing in to equalize an empty chamber or water flooding a sudden depression in the earth, the physical universe does not tolerate a true void.
It has to achieve equilibrium.
Precisely. It will force matter or energy into that space. So when this temporal pocket inflates within the timeline, it creates a vacuum in the fabric of reality.
Okay.
This physical void acts as a localized suction, creating an opening for foreign signals or even foreign entities from outside our standard dimension to seep in and fill the empty space.
And nature abhors a vacuum so much that by day 5, something officially takes advantage of the open door.
Yes, it does.
This is where the story turns into pure nightmare fuel for me. The observer is sitting there, watching the clock at midnight on the 5th day. 12.02 hits.
The second repeats.
The pocket stretches, the subjective time elongates, just like before. But this time, the void isn't silent.
No.
During that extended frozen moment, a voice emits directly from the wooden casing of the clock.
From the wood itself.
Yeah, and it's described as a soft voice, and it gives a single, incredibly distinct command. Stay.
Stay! It is a chilling detail, primarily because of its extreme brevity and its clear, directed intent.
So deliberate.
It is. When we think of supernatural auditory phenomena, we usually expect random, chaotic noise.
Banging on the walls, footsteps in the attic.
Or incoherent, layered whispering. But this is a targeted, solitary word. The source identifies this specific event as a sonic probe.
A sonic probe. You know, I hear that, and I immediately think of a submarine pinging sonar into the deep ocean, waiting to see if the sound waves bounce off a target.
Yes.
Is that essentially what's happening here?
That is a very accurate way to conceptualize it. The clock has ceased to be a mere timepiece. The expanding void has transformed it into a literal bridge.
A bridge to where?
To wherever this entity originates. The entity on the other side of this dimensional fracture is testing the stability of that bridge. When it sends that voice through, it isn't trying to have a conversation.
It's not just saying hello.
No, it is executing a systemic check. It wants to know if the connection is viable, if the void is stable enough to transmit acoustic information, and, most importantly, it is checking for a stable link between the anomaly itself and the human observer in the room.
It's feeling around in the dark to see if anyone is on the other end of the line.
Precisely.
And here's the truly horrifying part for the person sitting in that room.
Mm-hmm.
By sitting there, frozen in fear, listening to it, absorbing that word, the observer is essentially picking up the phone.
Yes, they're answering the ping.
If you hear a bump in the night and you freeze, you are just a passive victim of fear. But in this scenario, the source implies that acknowledging the voice is an active part of the process.
Exactly. By remaining in the room and focusing on the origin of the sound, they are confirming receipt of the signal.
They're engaging with it.
They are establishing a handshake protocol, to use a networking term, between our dimension and whatever exists inside the temporal pocket.
But a handshake protocol is just the beginning of a data transfer. The entity is just testing the waters.
Right. It needs more.
To actually cross over, to fully utilize this bridge it's building inside the clock, it needs more than just a momentary stretched second and a terrified listener. It needs a massive amount of power.
A tremendous amount.
Which logically means the physical mechanics of the room itself have to change to accommodate that power generation.
Yes. The anomaly cannot remain a passive glitch if it intends to facilitate a physical crossing. It must begin to generate and store localized energy.
And the source details exactly how this escalation happens. The glitch begins to multiply rapidly.
It compounds.
Yeah. 1 repeated second at midnight becomes 2 repeated seconds, then 3 consecutive pauses. The clock gets stuck at 12.02, repeating the tick,
straining against the timeline.
And there's this brilliant, terrifying detail from the text that I just love. While this antique clock is caught in this violent loop, the digital devices in the room.
Ah, yes. The modern tech.
Right. The observer's smartphone sitting on the coffee table, the microwave clock glowing in the kitchen, they are tracking time correctly.
They are unaffected.
They seamlessly move on to 12.03, 12.04, 12.05. But the antique clock is pulling away from consensus reality. It is generating impossible extra seconds that literally do not exist in our standard timeline.
This divergence between the digital clocks and the antique clock brings us to the core mechanical explanation of the entire phenomenon.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics.
The source refers to the clock acting as a temporal capacitor.
A temporal capacitor.
Yes. Now, if we connect this to the broader principles of electronics and physics, we know that a traditional capacitor in an electrical circuit is a component designed to store electrical energy.
Like a battery.
Similar to a battery, yes, but it discharges differently. It typically consists of two conductive plates, separated by an insulating material known as a dielectric.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
You pump an electrical charge into it, and the capacitor holds that energy, building up a voltage difference between the plates until it is connected to a closed circuit, at which point it discharges all that stored energy at once.
Okay, I understand how that works with a battery and copper wire,
Hmm.
but I'm struggling to translate that to a piece of vintage furniture.
It's a leap, certainly.
How does an antique wooden clock act as a capacitor? What are the conductive plates, and more importantly, what is the charge it's supposedly holding?
In this localized anomalous scenario, the physical room itself, bounded by its walls, floor, and ceiling, acts as the containment vessel, the
The
capacitor,
whole room.
the entire volume of the room, and the charge it is storing is not composed of electrons, but of these fractured looping seconds.
Storing time.
Exactly. Every single time the clock repeats a second. Every time it loops back and forces a moment of time to exist that shouldn't exist according to the rest of the universe. It adds another discrete unit of temporal energy to the system.
Wow.
It is literally packing impossible surplus time into a strictly confined physical space. As a result, the internal pressure within the room begins to skyrocket.
Okay, I have to stop you there because this is the part of the source material that legitimately gave me a panic attack.
It is quite claustrophobic.
It's horrifying. The text says that the physical environment reacts to this stored energy, and the room experiences an atmospheric density reaching a tipping point.
Yes.
It describes the air becoming heavy, almost gelatinous, and incredibly difficult to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we generally think of time as a completely abstract concept, right? It's just a measurement we use to make sure we aren't late for a meeting.
A social construct, almost.
Exactly. How does a warped timeline literally crush the oxygen out of a living room? Are we talking about time having actual physical mass?
It is a profound and terrifying concept, but it is rooted in actual theoretical physics.
Really? How so?
We intuitively separate space and time in our daily lives, but Albert Einstein fundamentally changed our understanding of the universe by proving that they are inexorably linked as a single fabric, space-time.
Right, space and time are one thing.
Massive objects like planets or black holes warp space-time with their gravity. But the reverse must also be considered in an anomalous framework.
Yeah.
In this room, severely warped time is generating a localized mass effect. The living room has a fixed geometric volume. It can only hold a certain amount of standard matter and energy.
Okay, that makes sense.
As the temporal capacitor stores these extra fractured seconds, it is forcibly introducing alien temporal mass into a closed system.
So it's like trying to overinflate a tire?
Precisely.
The air pressure inside just keeps building until the rubber is stretched to its absolute limit.
Exactly like that. The localized physics of the room are breaking down because the environment is struggling to contain the sheer mass of accumulated stolen time.
And the observer can feel that.
Oh, yes. This breakdown manifests physically to the observer. The air molecules in the room are being compressed by the presence of a timeline that shouldn't be there.
That's why it's hard to breathe.
Yes. The observer feels like they have suddenly been transported thousands of feet underwater, or like they are trying to breathe a thick liquid instead of a gas.
Ugh, that sounds awful.
The atmosphere is thickening, becoming palpable because the very fabric of reality is buckling under the weight of the paradox.
That is just, it's a suffocating thought. You're sitting in your favorite armchair in the safety of your own home, and the very air around you is turning into lead because a wooden clock is hoarding extra seconds.
It turns your sanctuary against you.
It really does. But here is the critical pivot in the logic of the source. A capacitor, as you explained earlier, stores energy,
Correct.
but it cannot store energy indefinitely. Eventually, a capacitor needs a circuit to discharge that energy, or it will simply fail. It can't just hold the tension forever.
It requires a release.
And the terrifying revelation of this deep dive is that the missing piece of that circuit, the final component needed to trigger the discharge and blow the dimensional doors wide open, is the listener.
The observer.
It's the human observer in the room.
This is exactly where the theoretical physics of the anomaly crash violently into human psychology and the quantum mechanical concept of the observer effect.
Okay, the observer effect. The narrative of the source aims this realization directly at the person sitting in the room. The entity inside the clock, the thing that has been sending the sonic probes and steadily building the atmospheric pressure to a crushing degree, cannot complete its task alone.
No, it cannot.
It requires your attention to stabilize the process. I kept wondering while reading this, why doesn't the person just get up and leave the house? Why sit there for 9 days letting the pressure build?
It is a horrific realization, and to understand why they don't leave, we have to look at the observer effect, which loosely posits that the mere act of observing a phenomenon inevitably changes the state of that phenomenon.
Like Schrodinger's cat.
Exactly. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in a state of probability, a wave of potential locations, until they are actively observed or measured.
Right.
At the moment of observation, the wave function collapses, and the particle takes a fixed, definite position in reality.
Okay, I follow.
In the context of this temporal anomaly, the dimensional fracture initially created by the clock is highly chaotic. It is unstable, fluctuating rapidly.
So it's just a wave of probability.
Yes,
Yeah.
but by focusing their attention on the clock, by obsessively watching the hands repeat and allowing the dread to wash over them, the human observer acts as the measurement device.
Oh, wow.
They force the chaotic probability of the fracture to collapse into a stable, physical reality in their living room. They complete the circuit.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the victim's consciousness is acting as an anchor.
Exactly, an anchor.
The focused attention, fueled by their own terror, provides the steady, directed energy required to force the dimensional fracture wide open. The anomaly needs a focal point in our reality to lock onto, and the observer's paralyzed, terrified gaze is providing exactly the tether it needs.
That is exactly the mechanism. It is a parasitic relationship based entirely on human observation.
That is the ultimate, cruelest trap imaginable. The victim is actively, if unknowingly, powering their own nightmare just by looking at it.
It feeds on their attention.
Imagine the psychological toll of this dread building over those 9 days. We glossed over it a bit earlier, but let's really linger on what those 9 days must feel like.
The compounding terror.
Right. You are trapped in a room. You can barely draw a full breath because the air is so thick with compressed stolen time. You look down at your smartphone, desperate for a connection to the real world, and the screen says it's 12:07 a.m.
But you look up at the wall.
And the antique clock is violently shuddering, the gears grinding against a physical barrier, repeating 12:02 over and over and over again.
And the whole time, this entity is basically feeding off your gaze.
Yes, it is using your fear and your unbroken attention as a literal power cable to rip a hole into your living space.
And you asked earlier why the observer doesn't simply leave.
Yeah, why don't they just run out the front door?
It speaks to a deep primal flaw in human psychology. The inability to look away from a disaster. It is the extreme manifestation of the car crash effect.
Oh, you don't want to look,
Yeah.
but you can't stop yourself.
Exactly. When we encounter something that shatters our understanding of reality, our brains lock onto it in a desperate attempt to process and understand the threat.
We're trying to make sense of the senseless.
Yes. The entity is exploiting this instinct. The phenomenon cannot reach its climax. It cannot generate enough stable energy to force a breach without the willing, albeit terrified, participation of the host.
So the observer stays. They stay because they are paralyzed by the impossibility of what they are seeing.
Frozen in place.
And that pressure builds and builds for 9 agonizing days. The room gets heavier, the ticking gets more strained, the temporal capacitor gets fuller and fuller with impossible energy.
Which brings us to the breaking point.
Day 10, the climax of the entire event.
The absolute limit of the containment vessel, the point of discharge.
Let's set the scene for the final night, day 10. The pressure in the room has reached its absolute peak.
It's unbearable.
The air is so heavy it feels like a physical weight sitting directly on the observer's chest. Every breath is a conscious, exhausting effort. The ticking of the clock is no longer just a sound, it's a vibration you can feel in your teeth.
It permeates everything.
The hands sweep up, it hits 11.59, then 12 found 0, and then at exactly midnight, or specifically, the dreaded 12.02 marker, The capacitor prepares to discharge all that stored temporal energy.
The breaking point.
And the text describes a culminating event called the zero-time freeze.
This is the exact moment the structural barrier of time completely fails. The elastic string of the timeline snaps.
Just snaps completely.
Yes. Physical reality in that localized space ceases to function entirely.
Everything stops. And I mean everything. The source is incredibly granular about what this freeze actually entails, and it's far worse than just a clock stopping.
The environmental effects are absolute.
The air in the room stops moving entirely. The dust motes hanging in the air freeze in place. All ambient noise from the outside world, a passing car down the street, the wind against the window, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, it all vanishes instantly.
A vacuum of sound.
It is absolute, dead, crushing silence. And most terrifyingly of all, the observer's heartbeat stops instantly.
I want to dwell on the physiological horror of that specific detail for a moment.
A stopped heartbeat.
Yes. Under normal medical circumstances, if your heart stops beating, your brain is deprived of oxygen, you lose consciousness almost immediately, and clinical death follows shortly after.
Right.
But we have to remember the rules of the anomaly. This is not biological death. This is a biological pause within frozen space-time.
So they aren't dying. They're just paused.
Exactly. The observer is fully conscious. They're fully aware of their surroundings, but they are completely trapped inside a paralyzed body.
I can't even imagine.
They are unable to draw breath because the lungs cannot expand in frozen air. They are unable to blink. They are unable to feel the comforting, rhythmic thud of their own pulse.
That's terrifying.
The forward momentum of their biological clock, the cellular processes that govern life, has been entirely suspended by the discharge of the anomaly. They are alive, but they are suspended in a state of absolute zero time.
I can't even fathom the panic of that. You are a prisoner inside your own skull.
Perfectly conscious, perfectly still.
And while the observer is completely paralyzed, perfectly frozen like a statue on their couch, they realize there is one single thing in the room that is still moving.
The anomaly itself.
Right. The only movement in the entire space exists inside the antique clock. The wooden gears are continuing to turn, functioning perfectly smoothly within the void. The hesitation is completely gone.
Because the clock is no longer a part of our timeline.
Right, it broke through.
The friction is gone. It is fully transitioned into the temporal pocket it spent 10 days creating. It is now operating entirely on the physics of the other side.
And then comes the breach. The visual culmination of this entire 10-day nightmare. The dimensional collapse completes.
The manifestation.
The observer, completely paralyzed, eyes locked on the clock face, suddenly sees something materializing. A silhouette becomes visible behind the glass of the clock face.
Inside the clock.
And it's very clear. This is not a reflection of the room. It is a shadow emerging from deep inside the physical wooden casing of the clock.
From the void.
And it doesn't just stay behind the glass like a picture. It presses outward. The text describes it physically distorting the clock face, warping the wood, and bending the glass outward as it prepares to enter the room.
The capacitor has fully discharged.
All that energy.
Yes, the stored energy of those fractured seconds has shattered the barrier between dimensions. The void has been pushed open wide enough and stabilized long enough by the observer's gaze for a physical manifestation to cross the threshold into our reality.
And as it presses against the glass, warping the clock face, the entity speaks one final time.
The final message.
It doesn't say hello or I am here. It doesn't roar or scream. It delivers a final transmission confirming exactly how it managed to break through. It simply says, you stayed.
You stayed. This raises a fascinating, albeit deeply disturbing philosophical point about the true nature of vulnerability.
What do you mean?
The observer realizes, in that final frozen moment of paralysis, that their physical presence was the absolute key to their own destruction.
Clear the battery.
Yes. It wasn't the antique clock that doomed them. The clock was merely a tool, a wedge placed in the door.
Right.
By simply not leaving the room, by allowing their primal curiosity and their paralyzing fear to glue them to their chair for 10 days, they acted as the final, essential component of the bridge.
They completed the circuit.
They provided the observer effect necessary to collapse the wave function of the anomaly into reality. They held the door open for the creature to cross over.
It's the ultimate victim blaming by a supernatural entity, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm only here because you held the door for me.
It really is.
It is a stunning, horrific realization to end the narrative on. because it completely changes how we view the
It,
event.
it recontextualizes everything.
It wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't a ghost with unfinished business tied to a piece of furniture or a demon summoned by a ritual.
No, not at all.
It was a cold, calculated, physical breach of time's structural barrier, and the engine that powered that breach was entirely fueled by human attention.
Exactly. It forces a complete recontextualization of the entire narrative and indeed of our own reality.
How so?
Well, time is not just a convenient metric we use to measure our days. It is the load-bearing wall of our physical existence.
The load-bearing wall. I like that.
It is the structural barrier that keeps our dimension sealed off from whatever chaotic, hostile forces exist outside of it. And the dark warning that the source material leaves us with must be taken with extreme gravity.
What's the warning?
It is not just a scary story. It presents itself as a set of instructions for survival in a universe where these dimensional barriers are far more fragile than we believe.
So if we take this source at face value, what is the protocol? What do you do if you encounter a temporal anomaly?
The protocol is immediate disengagement.
Just walk away.
Yes. If your clock ever repeats a second, if you ever witness a mechanical device accurately recording a localized fracture in reality, you must fight every human instinct you have.
Don't stare at the car crash.
Exactly. Do not try to understand it. Do not pull out your smartphone to record it for the internet. Do not provide the focused attention it desperately needs to stabilize the breach.
You have to leave.
You must walk away immediately. You must physically leave the space and remove your consciousness from the circuit.
You have to break the connection.
Right.
You have to starve the anomaly of the observer effect.
Yes. Because to observe it, to acknowledge its impossible existence, is to invite it in.
It is such an incredibly dense, unnerving concept. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We certainly have.
We've explored how an antique artifact with a hesitant tick can act as a temporal capacitor, hoarding stolen seconds until the atmospheric pressure of the room literally crushes the oxygen from your lungs.
The physical weight of time.
We've unpacked the physics of how a temporal pocket creates a localized vacuum that alien entities can use to ping our dimension with a sonic probe.
The handshake protocol.
And most importantly, we've seen how human attention, driven by fear and curiosity, is the final fatal ingredient needed to pull a nightmare through the glass of a clock face.
It is a narrative that forces a complete reevaluation of our relationship with time, space, and the seemingly innocuous devices we use to track our lives.
It really does. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Oh, I'm ready.
Something that builds on this dark warning, but brings it right into your everyday life.
Mm.
We've established that time is the structural barrier keeping our dimension sealed. And we know that breaching it requires two fundamental things: a localized anomaly and a human observer locking their attention onto it to stabilize the connection.
Right.
So think about your average day. Think about being at work,
Yeah.
sitting at your desk as the afternoon drags on, or sitting in a sterile doctor's waiting room, or lying in bed at 3 a.m. when you absolutely can't sleep.
Those quiet, empty moments.
How many times a day do you stare blankly at a ticking clock on the wall, watching the second hand sweep around, just waiting for the minute to change?
Just zoning out completely.
How often do you lock your unbroken attention onto the measurement of time, slipping into a completely trance-like state, unknowingly offering your consciousness as a potential anchor?
That is a terrifying thought.
If a microscopic temporal pocket were to open right in front of you during one of those mundane, hypnotic moments, would you even notice the second repeating?
Or would you just keep staring?
Exactly. Would you just keep staring, completely oblivious, holding the door wide open for something on the other side? Stay curious out there, stay observant. But maybe trust your digital clocks just a little bit more today.